Pitams, we can play it again since still 2 minutes early, so we can let people in. All right. Let me just share my screen. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics and Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development Seminar Series. We are actually on season 5 of this seminar series. And this semester, we are still doing it online to let more people, to reach a wider audience and also to invite international speakers to this seminar. We had just taken you to a virtual tour of the campus, so I hope you enjoyed that little video. But we do hope to welcome you physically in campus. So before we start, my name is Maha Rabago. I'm an associate professor at the Ateneo de Manila University, and I usually moderate the seminar. So before we start, let me just remind everyone of our house rules in case you are new to this seminar series. We will let the speaker finish her presentation first before we entertain questions. Zoom participants, kindly stay muted and stop sharing your video during the duration of the presentation, except of course our speaker. During the Q&A, please virtually raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged. You may unmute and show yourself when asking your questions. We're now live streaming on YouTube. If you can post also your comment in the comment sections or your questions in the comment sections, we would be happy to ask them out for you. Slide videos and other materials from the seminar are posted in our website and also in the university's YouTube channel, only when the speaker gives his or her consent for sharing them. Let me now introduce to you our speaker this morning. It's actually evening in her area. She is an associate professor of economics at Amherst College, a development economist. Her work largely examines the impacts of migration on origin developing countries, with particular attention to the effectiveness of migration as a potential development strategy. Most recently, she collaborated with the Philippine Department of Labor and Employment on a large-scale randomized evaluation of their key anti-child labor program. Her work has been published in outlets such as the Review of Economics and Statistics, American Economic Journal, Applied Economics, and the Journal of Development Economics. She received her PhD in Economics and Public Policy from the University of Michigan in 2014 and her BA in Economics from the Colby College in 2006. This morning, she is here with us to present her research titled Behavioral Responses to Temporary Migration, an Examination of Origin Country Fertility. Without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Caroline Theoharides. Caroline, the virtual screen is yours.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Great, can y'all see that okay?
Yes, yes.
Perfect, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to, to be at Ateneo, albeit virtually. I should mention at the start of this that, in fact, my research assistants from Amherst College actually stayed at Ateneo for about a month when we were working on collecting the data for this project. So special thanks should go to Ateneo for this project even being possible, because they spent a wonderful month there being hosted in the economics department and spending time in Manila and then in the Philippines in general. That was back in 2017, so it takes a long time before the project comes to fruition, but I'm very grateful for that, and I'm hoping we can continue that sort of partnership with students going back and forth going forward. So let me start with this project, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. So basically what we're thinking about in this project. So migration matters for developing countries, and we can think about international migration as a key labor market option for many individuals coming from developing countries. And I think, presenting this to an audience in the Philippines, I think you have thought much harder and much more about migration than most audiences that I present my work to. And so it's really a pleasure to get to talk about this with a group of people who think about this, these impacts of migration in such deep and important ways. And so I'm really looking forward to your feedback on the project in general, the economics behind that project, but in particular, the ways in which you think we've gotten things right about the Philippines and the ways in which you may think we have gotten things wrong. I think all of those comments will be really valuable for us as we continue to revise this work. I think broadly, what economists have documented is that migration impacts origin countries and particularly origin communities of migrants in a whole bunch of different ways. So first, there are income gains, which are probably obvious. When individuals are moving abroad, they typically experience large gains in income. There's some nice work by some individuals in Mexico, but in particular, I'm going to highlight this work by Dean Yang, who I know has presented in your seminar series before from 2008, which shows that household investment increases in response to migration, and that work was done in the Philippines. There's also been work that shows that international migration leads to increases in education. So I have some earlier work that showed increases in secondary enrollment, switching into private institutions from public institutions as a result of positive migrant shocks. And then I have some work with an Ateneo alumni, Paulo Abarcar, I think he presented this here last year, looking at the effects of demand from the US for visas for Filipino nurses and the impacts that that had on the education system in the Philippines. So there have been lots of impacts on education. There's also documentation, again in the Philippines by Yang and Choi, of reductions in risk. So they look at shocks from typhoons and from rainfall and show that when there are international migrants abroad, these shocks are less severe. In some work in Mexico, the authors show that when there are shocks, negative shocks in the destination country, this leads to more migrants returning back home again. And as a result, it leads to adverse implications on the origin country labor market as well. And then finally, in some work that I believe Dean Yang presented here last year, Dean and I and a couple of co-authors show that international migration can lead to positive long-run economic development. And we're really excited about that work because I think that that's something that maybe has been in question for a long time. And we're happy to be able to show that there are some long-run economic development benefits as a result of migration responding to the Asian financial crisis. So these are all different ways that migration can have impacts on origin communities. There we are. But what we're going to be thinking about here, oops, I skipped a slide, is the way migration might impact norms and beliefs. Okay, so what I'm thinking about here is that migrants, particularly temporary migrants like OFWs that are going on temporary contracts, often repeatedly, but that are planning to return back home to their country of origin, they often keep close ties with their origin communities. And so while they're abroad, they spend time in a culture that's often quite different from their origin community. Okay. And so what this means is that upon their return, or even while they're still abroad, when they're using WhatsApp or Skype or Zoom or Facebook to keep in touch with family members, this exposure to these different cultural practices could have an influence on the behavior and preferences in the origin communities. Okay, and so this has really been a new line of inquiry for economists, and there's some recent work showing that exposure to destination policies and destination country policies and attitudes through migration can have an effect on a number of things. So I think most of this work has been surrounding political beliefs and has been looking at the impact of migration on voting patterns and political beliefs, trying to isolate the political beliefs in the destination country. So I think maybe the best work on this was actually done in the country of Moldova. And they looked at migrants that some of whom were going to Western Europe and some of whom were going to Russia. And they show that it was basically pretty random whether the migrants went to Western Europe or they went to Russia at the outset. But what they show is that after the duration of this temporary migration, when they came back, villages that sent more migrants to Western Europe were less likely to vote for Communist Party individuals, whereas migrants that went to Russia and came back to their villages, those villages had a much higher share of voting for the Communist Party. And so they document this as like a change in preferences based on the exposure that these individuals had. And they do a lot in the paper to show that it's not, in fact, about that migrants who had communist leanings went to Russia, but it really was, kind of as good as random. There's also some nice new work that shows that gender norms may change. So this work is mostly done with migrants from Egypt to other Middle Eastern countries, and showing that when they're exposed to different gender norms at destination, they bring these gender norms back home with them. Okay. So what we're going to be thinking about in this paper, though, is can migration affect fertility decisions? Okay, so what we're thinking is that the transmission of fertility behavior is another way in which migration may impact development in origin countries. Okay, the logic behind this is that fertility decisions in terms of how many children a household chooses to have or whether or not they adopt various contraceptive methods may vary substantially between destination and origin countries. Okay, and so as a result, destination fertility behavior may diffuse back to the country of origin. So perhaps I'm a migrant and I go to a country that has a much higher birth rate than my country, and I see, that it's the normal family size is to have about 5 kids. Maybe I come back home and I have more children as a result. Or on the other hand, maybe I go to a country where the average is to have 1 or 2 children, say Italy or something like that. Maybe I come back home and I have different preferences now. I want to have fewer children than I wanted to have before. Okay, and we're thinking about that this could happen through a variety of different mechanisms. Okay, so first it could come through changes in income. All right, we have pretty good evidence in demography and in economics that as income rises, people have fewer children. And so maybe it's just that migrants earn more money. And so migrants are earning more money, and this subsequently leads to declines in fertility. Or maybe it's about information. Maybe it's that the migrants are being exposed to new information, either about contraceptive methods or about, reasoning why they might want to have fewer children or more children. So maybe it's just about information and they're learning things while they're abroad. Or maybe it's an actual change in preferences, and their preferences are changing based on the preferences of the country of destination that they're in. Okay, and I think this is important because these sorts of fertility decisions have lots of consequences for development, both at a micro and a macro level. Okay, I think that these big questions surrounding fertility rates and development are something that have gotten a lot of attention from development economists, for decades. And so migration, being so there are such huge flows of people across borders, I think understanding the way migration may also have implications for fertility is important in that regard. So the causal question that we're going to try to answer in this paper is what is the effect of exposure to destination country reproductive health policies through temporary migration on fertility decisions in the origin country? Okay, and we really want to try to isolate the causal effect, so we're able to say that this is about exposure to these policies having an effect on fertility decisions, not something about who chooses to migrate versus who doesn't choose to migrate. But I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. Okay, so what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to examine the effect of exposure to what I'm going to call more liberalized reproductive health policies. Okay, what I mean by liberalized is I mean reproductive health policy defined as having fewer legal restrictions. Okay, I'm not trying to put, the word liberal is pretty loaded in the United States, and so I'm not trying to put any sort of political leanings on this word. I'm just trying to say that liberalized is fewer legal restrictions. Okay, so we're going to examine the effect of exposure to fewer legal restrictions on reproductive health policy, on fertility and contraceptive decisions in the Philippines. Okay, and so the way that we're going to do this is we're going to exploit spatial variation in the Philippines, as well as temporal variation in policies across destination countries for OFWs. Okay, so in particular, what we do is we create a destination-specific policy index. Okay, so we create a policy index about how liberalized policies are for, say, Saudi Arabia, for Malaysia, for the United States, for Italy, for all of the top destinations, or for all of the destinations, not just top destinations, but for all of the destinations of OFWs. And then what we do is we create exposure weights based on data that I'll talk more about, but that we have from the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration that shows us the share of migrants from each municipality to each destination. And so then we create a municipality-specific measure where we say, okay, suppose 50% of migrants from municipality A go to Saudi Arabia, then Saudi Arabia will be 50% of the weight for that municipality. Suppose 25% go to Japan and 25% go to Hong Kong, then we'll weight those accordingly to get this weighted index measure of these policies. Okay, and I'll go through some more careful examples of that a bit later. We're then going to interact that with the historical density of migrants, okay? Because what we think is that, you could have two municipalities that have the same exposure composition, 50% Saudi Arabia, 25% Japan, 25% Hong Kong. But of course, it matters a lot if that municipality is sending 5% of its population versus 0.5% of its population. So we're gonna weight that by that historical density. And so then we'll identify effects on fertility based on changes in destination countries, holding constant the baseline migration rate. And I think this is really important that we hold constant the baseline migration rate, because one of the concerns you might have with fertility is like, well, of course fertility rates go down when there's migration because the people are gone. They can't have a baby if they're separated from their spouse or their partner. And so we're going to hold that constant and hold constant the fact that people are abroad and then look at these changes, okay? And so what we find that there are declines in fertility and there's increased use of modern contraceptives. Okay, so I mean things like the pill, for instance. And the mechanism appears to be coming through changes in preferences, though those results are a bit preliminary. So I'll be curious what you think about those as well. So in terms of contributions, broadly what our paper does is it contributes to the literature on the effects of migration on origin countries, okay? And so there's a long literature that I talked about on the first slide that does this, and so we're hoping that we can contribute to that literature. But more specifically, we're hoping to be able to contribute to the growing literature on the transmission of destination country behavior and preferences back to origin communities. Specifically though, we hope to add to the literature on the effects of migration on origin country fertility. And so a lot of this literature, there's been some work done in this, but most of this literature compares migrants to non-migrants. And so looks at the difference in fertility between migrants and non-migrants, or they'll look at areas with more migration compared to areas with less migration. And so these papers, while really interesting, are a bit problematic in terms of trying to identify the causal effect, because I think one thing that we know is that the people who choose to be an OFW versus the people who maybe choose not to be an OFW are probably different along a variety of dimensions, one of which may be fertility, okay? And so if we were to do that, we might attribute the effect of migration to the decline in fertility, when really it's just that there are differences between migrants and non-migrants that are driving these differences. Some more recent work compares fertility outcomes of migrants to different destinations. So it basically is holding constant that everyone's a migrant, but it's saying, okay, well, let's compare people who go to Saudi Arabia, where maybe there's a higher birth rate, compared to people who go to Italy, where there's a lower birth rate, and see the difference. But what we're going to do is we're going to build upon that, where we're looking at different destinations, and we're going to have shocks to policies that are happening in the destination countries, where there are these changes in policies that we can basically take as exogenous, because I think it's what we want is we want to have that these policies are happening outside the Philippines. And so it's hard to imagine that, Saudi Arabia is changing their abortion policy in response to the Philippines' migration policy. So it seems pretty good to assume that these sorts of policies are happening essentially exogenously from what's going on in the Philippines. Okay, a couple other things we'll do. We're going to focus on the entire community. Okay, we're not just going to focus on migrant households, but we're going to think about the entire community. And I think this is important because one of the things I'm really interested in is thinking about the ways this information might be diffused throughout the entire community or the barangay of the migrant. We have some nice data from the Philippine DHS that's going to allow us to more directly explore mechanisms than has been able to be done in the literature before. Okay, so I skipped a slide. Okay, so usually when I present this paper, I have to spend about 15 minutes on this slide about thinking about OFWs in the Philippines. So I think we can go quite quickly here today. Lots of people have lots and lots of questions about this usually, but I think you all are probably pretty familiar. So I'll just go through this pretty quickly. But one of the reasons I always try to tell people who don't do work specifically on the Philippines about why it's so important to study the Philippines is that so many countries globally are trying to emulate the migration program that the Philippines has through POEA and OA, now the Department of Migrant Workers. And so I think understanding what has gone well for the Philippines and understanding what maybe could be improved is really important. Of course, for the Philippines, approximately 2% of the population is migrating in terms of these temporary contract visas each year. The modal length of contracts through POEA is about 24 months. And then the top destination countries are largely in the Middle East and Asia, but we also have a large number of individuals that are going to the US, Canada, and the EU. We're going to be using data from POEA, and so these workers are working in a wide range of occupations, both high-skilled and low-skilled occupations. In some earlier work, one thing that I tried to document pretty carefully was the importance of migrant networks in terms of where migrants go, and so showing that, I think the classic example that I like to give people is that, people from Batangas are more likely to go to Italy. We see this really strong migrant network coming from Batangas and people continuing to migrate to Italy, for instance. And so that's going to be important because we're going to rely on these sorts of migrant networks in terms of exposure to these policies at destination. In terms of reproductive health in the Philippines, I think the Philippines is an interesting place to think about fertility because the Philippines has experienced slower declines in fertility than other countries in Southeast Asia. Contraceptive adoption has been increasing from about 47% in 1998 to about 55% in 2013. There are high numbers of reported unplanned pregnancies and women that are reporting unmet need for contraceptives. But there have been shifts in recent years toward more what are often deemed modern methods rather than traditional methods, with the pill being one of the most common. Okay, so what we're going to use in terms of our reproductive health data, we're going to use a couple of different sources. Okay, so first we're going to use 6 waves of the Philippine census, and I have from the government, I have the 100% census. So we're able to construct municipality year birth rates based on the 100% census. Okay, and so what I do is I create this panel, basically a 20-year panel of municipality year birth rates over time. Okay, so that's really nice because it's based on the 100% census, so we can really make sure we're getting accurate counts of these birth rates. But one of the limitations of the census, of course, is that it doesn't include that many variables. And so we're going to also use 4 waves of the Philippine DHS, the Demographic Health Survey, which is a great survey in terms of health outcomes that I'm sure some of you have used. We're going to use the years 1998, 2003, 2008, and 2013. And so what the DHS is it's a comprehensive survey of women aged 15 to 49, so women of key childbearing age. And we're going to construct a birth year panel from their retrospective birth histories. So basically what they do is they ask women to go back over 20 years, and they ask them detailed questions about all of their pregnancies, all of their births, what happened to those births, et cetera. So it has these pretty detailed birth histories, but what it also has is it has detailed retrospective calendars of contraceptive use. And so we're able to trace out 5-year histories of their contraceptive use. It's a month-by-month calendar. So we have this in 1998 and 2003. So it's a more limited sample. One of the reasons that we also want to look at birth rates with the DHS is that the DHS isn't meant to be representative in the Philippines at the municipality level. And so before we use it to look at some of the contraceptive results, we want to show that our DHS results and our census results are quite similar in terms of the impacts on birth rates. And so I'll show you that a bit later. We also do a bunch of robustness checks to show that this isn't being driven by outlier municipalities that might be causing problems in the data, but by just keeping municipalities that have large samples, for instance. Okay, in terms of the migration data, I've been working in the Philippines since 2009, and one of the partners that has been completely influential in my research has been the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration, which of course now is the Department of Migrant Workers. But so what I do is I have a database from POEA on all OFWs that have left the Philippines between 1992 and 2016. Okay, so this is about 7 million individual records that tells me where the individual goes abroad, the wages that they earn, and the municipality that they're from in the Philippines. And so what this allows me to do is to create this municipality level exposure. Okay, so I know their location of origin, just the municipality. I don't know more detail than municipality. And I know the destination country for all of these 7 million migrants. I also know their gender and their occupation. And so what I'm able to do is I use the baseline data. The first year of data I have is 1992. And I use this to measure the intensity of migrants. So this is just the total number of migrants in 1992 from a municipality divided by the population of that municipality. And then I also get the destination mix. And so when I say the destination mix, what I'm using the data for is I'm trying to get the share of migrants going to each destination out of the total number of OFWs from that municipality. Okay, so those are the two important things I'm going to use this POEA data for. Because I have these geographic identifiers at the municipality level, I'm able to match at the municipality level with the census and DHS data in order to link these fertility outcomes with the POEA migration data. Okay, the final piece of data that we have, which is important for how we're going to estimate this paper, is we have basically a reproductive health policy database. Okay, so we got this data set from some individuals at the Harvard School of Public Health, Finley, Canning, and Poe. And so what they did was they created a country decade specific index on reproductive health. Okay, this had nothing to do with migration, what they were doing. They were just trying to document reproductive health laws in 186 different countries. So they collected this information on reproductive health laws in 186 countries. They classified the laws into 5 categories: abortion, condom, pill, IUD, and sterilization. And they created a separate index for each of these. I'm going to show you exactly how they created these. And so for each index, there's a scoring mechanism that determines the level of liberalization or the level of legal restrictions that these policies have. Okay, so let me show you this for the pill. Okay, so for the pill is going to be scored in 6 different categories. Okay, so the sale purpose, the sale location, the prescription requirement, whether there's a subsidy, and whether commercial advertising is legal. Okay, so if we look at commercial advertising, what you can see is that if commercial advertising is illegal, then that means for commercial advertising, this particular country would get a score of 0. Okay, if commercial advertising for the pill is legal without restrictions, that's the blue box, you can see that this would give it a score of 3. Okay, so the maximum number of points for the pill is 12 points. Okay, that would be if there was total liberalization. Okay, so if every category was as liberalized as it could be. So the sale purpose was for contraceptive use. The sale location was that you could just buy it in a shop. The prescription requirement was that you didn't have a prescription. Okay, that would be the maximum number of points. And so the sub-index for the pill is defined as the number of points the country receives divided by the total possible number of points. Okay, so if everything was 0 except commercial advertising was legal without restrictions, then that score would be 3 divided by 12. Okay. So what we wanted to, so we do this for each of these 5 things. We do this for abortion, condom, pill, IUD, and sterilization laws, or actually these authors did this and were able to use their data. And then to create a composite index, we standardize each of these sub-indices and we average across all 5 of them. Now, the Finley, Canning, and Poe data is decade specific, but we want to know the exact year that the policy change happened. And so we worked with a team of research assistants in order to determine the exact year these policy changes happened so that we could create a country year specific data set for these indices. Okay, and so then what we do is we have this country specific index, and we're able to match this to the migrant flow data set at the country year level. Okay, so we're able to see that there's an OFW that went to Saudi Arabia in, say, in say 1995, and so then we attribute that that index to that. Okay, so let me show you what this looks like. Okay, so in terms of policy variation, what sort of variation are we thinking about across these different destination countries? So we have 214 destination countries that we're thinking about here. And so what you can see is that in terms of all policy types, 66% of countries had some type of change over our sample period. The majority of these changes were changes in policies surrounding the birth control pill or condoms. So 41% had a change in the pill, and 33% had a change in some policy change surrounding condoms. Okay, in terms of policy variation, what's the most liberalized? Okay, well, if you look at the mean column, column 1, what you can see, so we're thinking about the max level of liberalization. So 100% would mean that the policy is completely liberalized and there are no restrictions. Okay, so the most liberalized of these policies across our different countries is sterilization. Okay, where it's about at almost 84% liberalization, versus say abortion, which is only excuse me, has many more legal restrictions across our different destination countries that we're thinking about here. Okay, in terms of the policy variation, I think one of the things that people often think when I talk about this paper is that, oh, reproductive health policies must always become more liberalized and have fewer restrictions. I think maybe that was true until recently, but of course, as we've seen in the United States is putting in more and more legal restrictions on reproductive health policies in recent years. And so that's true globally, that we see that there are some countries that are becoming more liberalized and some countries that are becoming less liberalized. On average, there are fewer legal restrictions globally. We see more density to the right of the zero, but there are plenty of countries that are imposing more legal restrictions to various types of reproductive health over time in our sample period, our sample being from 1990 to 2014. Okay, so in terms of our empirical strategy, we're going to have two key sources of variation. Okay, so perhaps ideally we would randomly assign, in terms of getting a causal effect, we could randomly assign migrants to get different exposure of reproductive health policies. Of course, that wouldn't be ethical in any sort of way. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use two key sources of variation that are naturally occurring. We're going to have temporal variation in destination country reproductive health policy. So this is, different destination countries are adopting these policies over time. And then we'll have spatial variation, both in the intensity of the amount of migration, as well as the destination mix of OFWs coming from the Philippines. Okay, so in terms of our empirical strategy, our outcome variable, YIMT, if we're thinking about our birth rate, this is just going to be a binary variable equal to 1 if woman I gave birth in municipality M in year T. Okay, and we're going to regress this on a bunch of stuff on the right-hand side. Okay, so first, we'll have the baseline migration rate in 1992 in the municipality. So that's migrate MT equals 0. Then we also have the liberalization index. Okay, we lag this 2 periods. The reason we lag this 2 periods or 2 years is because our thinking, and I'd be curious to get your feedback on this, is that because the typical contract is 2 years, the modal contract length is 24 months, we thought the most exposure would be if someone has migrated, they would be exposed 2 years earlier, and they're more likely to return to the Philippines after 2 years at the end of that contract. Okay, so we're lagging these policies 2 years in terms of their exposure. I could imagine that you might have other ideas of an underlying model, so I'd be curious to get your feedback on that. I think that, that's all I'll say about that for now. And so what this is this is a standardized liberalization index in the municipality. So what we've done is we've used the base share of migrant flows from the municipality to the destination to weight the index for each destination country, okay? And then we're going to aggregate these destination-specific measures at the municipality level. Our key coefficient of interest is beta 3, okay? This is the baseline migration rate interacted with the liberalization index, because what that's going to do is it's going to get at the exposure to these policies, but also include a measure of intensity, which I think is really important because, as I mentioned earlier, having 5% of your population migrate versus 0.5% of your population migrate is very different in terms of that exposure. Okay, we'll also include province fixed effects to control for any province-specific effects over time, and we'll have year fixed effects as well. So maybe there's a particular year that there was something happening in the Philippines as a whole, maybe the introduction of the reproductive health law or something where people are thinking about fertility differently. We want to control for any of those sorts of effects. We also have province-specific linear time trends to control for any differential changes in provinces over time. So the main identifying assumption that we have in our paper that we're assuming to try to claim that this is a causal impact is that in the absence of the policy change, fertility in municipalities with higher baseline migration would not have evolved differentially to provinces with lower baseline migration. Now, I think it's really important that we're not saying anything about the levels. It's totally fine for fertility to be at different levels for places with high levels of migration and low levels of migration. Okay, but what we don't want is for them to be trending differentially. Okay, so that's a standard parallel trends assumption that you might see in any difference in differences paper. But because we have this continuous liberalization index, so it's a continuous measure, we need what some new work by Callaway and co-authors call a strong parallel trends assumption. Okay, so what we need to assume is that municipalities that receive different intensities of treatment would have similar outcomes if they received identical treatment intensities. And so I think in our case, this is reasonable. This is often hard to show, but I think it's reasonable because all of the shock to reproductive health are actually occurring outside the Philippines. In fact, they're occurring quite far from the Philippines. And so it's hard to imagine that the Philippines is in some way having some impact on the reproductive health policies that are being adopted in Italy or the United States or Malaysia or something like that. Not impossible, but I think it's reasonable to assume that that's not going to be having an effect, and we can think of these things as happening for a variety of different reasons in the country of destination. Now, in terms of threats to this being a causal effect, I think there are a variety of different things you might be worried about. Okay, so conditional on the same level of migration, municipalities that have migrants in destinations with more liberal health policies may differ from those that don't. Okay, so maybe municipalities that themselves would like to have fewer legal restrictions surrounding reproductive health. Maybe their residents or their government are more likely to try to find destination countries that have similar ideals versus places that want more restrictions, find places that have those similar ideals. So what we do is we control for the baseline destination mix. Okay, so we're going to control for the fact that at baseline, a municipality may have chosen to send more people to Saudi Arabia because of something to do with their reproductive health policies. So we're going to control for that destination mix at baseline. The other thing that you might be worried about is that there could be either domestic policy in the Philippines that are changing simultaneously or destination-specific policies that are changing simultaneously with the reproductive health policies. So maybe a destination country is becoming more liberalized in terms of reproductive health policy, and they're also becoming a friendlier environment to OFWs. They're instituting better wage policies for migrant workers. And so there could perhaps be some sort of confounding of the effects that we have here. So what we do is we add a number of exposure-weighted controls that address these sorts of potential policies that could happen to show that that's not actually what's going to be driving the results. Okay, and finally, I mentioned this before, but our identification strategy means that changes in fertility are not simply due to the absence of individuals who are abroad. Okay, we're controlling for that baseline level of migration. So we have two municipalities with the same baseline level of migration, okay, so the same amount of individuals as a portion of the population that are abroad, and we shock one with this change in destination country policy, but not the other. Okay, I'm going to give you an example of that in just a second. Okay, so in terms of the identifying variation, so we're doing this at the municipality level. So you see there's 1,634. I should mention this is all municipalities as well as cities. Okay, that's how we get the 1,634. Okay, so all of our municipalities or cities experience a change in at least 1 year. Okay, you can see that mean of 1. Okay, the number of changes, though, varies considerably across municipalities. The average is about 4.5, okay, the number of policy changes they experience based on where their migrants go abroad, okay, but it ranges from one policy change in a particular destination country to 17, depending on that composition. The average weighted change is about 7.5 percentage points, and it's shifted toward more liberalized policies or less legal restrictions in these policies. Okay, so let me give you an example of the identifying variation that I think is helpful for thinking about the intuition that we're using here, okay? So in 1999, Japan approved the use of the pill for contraceptive purposes. So suppose you have two municipalities in Metro Manila, you've got Makati and Taguig, okay? So they have similar baseline migrant shares. They have 1.46% of the population from Makati migrated and 1.47 from Taguig. But what we have that's different here is the share of temporary migrants in Japan. So 25% of migrants from Makati went to Japan versus 6% to Taguig. And so what we're arguing is that those new policies that have been adopted in Japan are going to be transmitted much more to Makati than they would be to Taguig. Okay, so let me get to the results because I know we're starting to run short on time. Okay, so in terms of the effects on fertility, you can see in column 1 the main effects that we find here, which is that a 1 standard deviation increase in the liberalization index would lead to a 2.4 percentage point decline in fertility. Okay. A 1 standard deviation increase is pretty big, though, and we want to think about an average baseline migration rate. So what I've done is I've scaled the results to show you that if you consider the effect of a 0.1 standard deviation increase in liberalization in a municipality with an average baseline migration rate, which is about 2.2% of the municipality population, that's going to lead to about a 0.4% decline in fertility. So it's small, but I think it is meaningful when we think about that this is just coming through this transmission of norms. Okay, we're also curious if this is coming more through exposure of women to these policies at destination or male OFWs. And so we create the index specifically using female OFWs and male OFWs in columns 2 and 3. And what you can see is actually the effects are larger when men are exposed, which is not what we expected. We were expecting more of the effects to be coming through women. The other thing that we do is we separate our OFWs into domestic helpers versus not domestic helpers. We were interested to see if there would be differential impacts for individuals who are basically living in the house with families in the country and destination, rather than people who might be living in dormitories or their own apartments. And we see that, in fact, most of these declines are coming through exposure of domestic helpers, which would be happening much more in the home. Okay, the DHS results are similar. I'm going to skip that for now and just show you these effects on contraceptive use because I know I'm running short on time. What we find here is that there are large increases in adoption of modern contraceptive methods. So things like the pill or IUDs or condoms. And there are declines in traditional methods. So like the rhythm method or things like that. We find overall there's an increase in contraceptive methods, and it seems to mostly be coming through adoption of the birth control pill. Okay, and there seems to be some evidence of switching from traditional to modern contraceptive methods as a result. Now, one thing that you might be thinking about is, okay, sure, this is all interesting, but I think this is just coming through income because we know that migrants earn a lot more income. So what we do is in the POEA data, we have the wages that the migrants are earning. And so we actually control for the average wage, actually use the median migrant income in each municipality year to show that when we control away for income, these effects are still here. Okay, we don't have this in all years of our sample. So what I've done in panel B is I've replicated my main results, and then in panel C, I add those wage controls. And you can see there's not a lot of movement, suggesting that income is not the predominant channel that's driving this. Okay, let me just quickly show you my last results, and then I want to turn it over to you all for questions. So next, what we were interested in is whether this is coming through information. And we're limited a bit in terms of what we can do. And so column 1 is where we're thinking about information. So we use a number of questions to create an index about the number of contraceptive methods respondents have heard about, whether they have incorrect beliefs surrounding sterility, things along those lines. And we find there's not a statistically significant impact in terms of knowledge. But what we do find is that in terms of preferences, women update their desired fertility, or what we think might happen is women might update their desired fertility and thus adopt contraceptives to achieve those declines in fertility. We think that's why there are these changes in contraceptives. And so we create various measures to try to get at these norms. And the only place we see kind of some weak statistical significance is thinking about women's perceptions of fertility and birth spacing. And so we find that there's a statistically significant decline in terms of how many children women want to have and how much space they want between those children. So it's perhaps some suggestive evidence that women seem to update their behavior through preference modification, though I think there's maybe more to explore there. Okay, so just to conclude, what we find is that exposure to more liberalized reproductive health policy at destination results in fertility declines in origin communities. This appears to be achieved through increased use of modern contraceptive methods and appears to be perhaps due to changes in preferences rather than changes in income or information. Okay, and so I think hopefully what I've convinced you of is that provided further evidence that migration can lead to the transmission of destination country behavior to origin countries, and in as much as fertility impacts long-run development, the results suggest another mechanism through which migration may impact origin country development. So thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Really interesting paper. Yes, so we're now open to question and answer for the audience. Any questions? Let me start, Caroline, since people are still thinking about their questions. Actually, I have 2 questions. Maybe this has been taken care of in the fixed effects, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. With regards to the length of exposure, because you use the minimum of 2 years, right? So I'm not sure if you've taken into account, the length of exposure of migrants, because most people that do work overseas, they do it like most of them retired and then came home to the Philippines, at the age of 65. They say, I'm retired. But, I'm not sure if you've controlled for the length of exposure in the country of destination. So that might have an impact, not only for 2 years. And then with regards to the demographics of the OFWs, I know that some of the OFWs do bring their families. So I'm not sure whether you have that, whether you tease that out in the data, whether, it's only the member of the family that did migrate, or whether they brought their families with them. And that might also have, some effect on the results. So I'm not sure how you tease that out.
Yeah, thank you so much. These are great questions. And I think this is exactly why it's so wonderful that you all invited me, because you have such questions that no one else has brought up anywhere I've presented this. So these are great. In terms of the length of exposure, this is really interesting. And it's something we've really been wrestling with because the POEA data I should have mentioned is only the new hires. So what that means is it's just the new contracts. So I know it's your first contract with a particular employer, but it might be your 10th contract, right?
Yeah.
And you might renew that contract for 20 years then after that. And I don't know that. And so I think the thing that would be that we haven't controlled for is how much that might differ across destinations. And I don't know if you have if you or anyone else has any thoughts on that. Like, I think if it's true that all of our destinations behave in a similar way, that people stay till they're 65 and then they come back home again, I think that's okay because of the fixed effects. But if it's that people stay in Saudi for 5 years and then the conditions are so bad, they're like, I'm going back to the Philippines, I can't take this anymore. Whereas if they go to Italy, they stay till they're 65, then I think that could maybe be a problem for us in terms of the exposure, because it would vary like how long they're back for. I think the model I was trying to think about is like, oh, I go on a 2-year contract, then I come home for the month for Christmas, and then I go back on my contract. And so that's why I was thinking the 2 years. But I think if it's, does that make sense? Like if it's that different destinations, people like stay for their like working life versus not, I think that might be a problem that we need to think a little bit about. It's a great point. And the other thing in terms of the demographics of OFWs, if they brought their families, this is important. It's not something I had thought too much about. I thought about it a lot in the work with Paulo, because we were using data from CFO where everybody's bringing their families with them. But here, I think this will matter for certain destinations like Italy, where that's very possible. And so maybe we need to look at, I think what we should do maybe as a robustness check is look at the countries where there are good family reunification policies. So I think Canada, Italy, for instance, both often allow them to bring their families. And maybe we could look at heterogeneity by places where they bring their families versus not. Do you think that would maybe get at it?
Yeah, because I have relatives. Of course, I think most Filipinos have relatives
Exactly.
abroad, so they would know. There are instances where they brought their family, and then the children studies already in the destination country. So that would have an impact if those observation is in your data, because
Yeah.
both the husband and the wife are exposed to this kind of policies that you mentioned about.
Yep.
So that
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point. It's not just the OFW. It's like yeah. Okay. Yep. I've got to think a little bit more about that, but it's a great point. Thank you so much for raising it. Yeah, I've got to think about how we can address that a bit better. Thank you.
Yeah, we have an audience who's raising his hand. Vincent, who will be our speaker also.
Hi, good morning, Mama. Good evening, Professor Caroline.
Thanks.
So I guess my question is, I think the missing puzzle piece in the causal link for me is establishing that the changes in policies in the destination country actually change the preferences or the beliefs of the migrants themselves. And I think that's important because my impression of the Filipino diaspora of migrants is that they're relatively conservative, right? So I'm just looking at California, for instance, one of the most liberal states in the US. And among all Asian immigrant groups, right, of countries of origin, it's actually Filipinos with the highest opposition to Proposition 1, right? So in other words, like if they're not changing their beliefs as a response to more reproductive health policies, more liberal reproductive health policies in the destination country, then how can they transmit, any preferences or any beliefs to the origin municipality? So that's my first question. And my second question is, I know that you found a negative effect in your analysis. I was wondering how you think we should think about these negative effects. Do you think these are actual declines in fertility? Like what demographers would call the quantum effect, or should we consider this as more of like a postponement effect, right? That actually just migrants would rather wait until their contract is over and then they come home and then they that's when they have their children. And I think this is relevant as an alternative mechanism because, for instance, if a municipality has a higher intensity, then even without transmission, the preferences to migrate of the origin municipality might actually be higher, right? And when it's higher, then more people want to move or have aspirations to migrate, and then that leads to postponement, right? And that maybe could explain that. But I think when you establish parallel trends, then my alternative mechanism won't hold anymore. But I guess I'll end here. Thanks so much again, Professor Karin.
Great. Thank you so much, Vincent. These are great questions. I think I'll take your second question first. I think this is really important, and it's something because I think even in addition to the postponement effect, it could change like preferences for birth spacing. So instead, I have two kids, they're 2 years apart. Maybe it would have changed my preferences to make them 4 years apart, but I still have the same number of kids, right? It's not even that I'm abroad, but I just think like, oh, you should have kids further apart than I was having them. And so I have my two boys 4 years apart instead, something like that. And I think, so one thing that we did that I didn't show you here is we tried to show, we separated out for younger women versus older women in terms of their exposure. So, they're all still of childbearing age, because what we should see then is that there's some, increase in fertility for like older women if they're having their children a bit later. And we don't find anything for them. It seems to all be coming through the younger women. So like the 15 to 29 year olds, 15 to 30 year olds. And so I think what that's suggesting is that it is kind of this meaningful, because we see this decline and then we never see it pick back up again for the older women. I I don't know. What do you think about that? Does that seem reasonable? That's kind of how we were thinking about it, but it's a good point. We should make that a bit more explicit, that it's not just like, is it meaningful? I think, yeah, I guess I was thinking about, is it meaningful as slightly differently than the way you phrased it, which, and I think this is another question we should think about too, is it meaningful in the sense of like, sure, fertility declined in this 2-year period post-exposure, but did this change like long run preferences for fertility too, right? And I think that's actually something I haven't thought a lot about, but I think is really important, because is this just that like, 2 years later, people had fewer babies because they had this exposure, and there was media all over the place in Saudi Arabia talking about like using the pill or something like that. But 10 years from now, everybody's gone back to their normal behavior. And I think that's something we need to think about. I don't have a great answer for that. But I think in terms of the postponement, I think it is meaningful in that regard, because I think it's not just changing spacing, but it's actually changing their fertility. But we should probably look at that explicitly. We can actually look at the birth spacing of these women, because we know what's really nice about the DHS is they tell us exactly when they had each child. So we can look at if birth spacing is increasing or if that's staying pretty constant, and it actually is these declines in fertility. So I think that might better get at your question. Does that make sense? Yeah, and then in terms of the causal link, I think, honestly, I think this is one of the reasons the Philippines is such an interesting place to think about this, is because exactly what you're saying about these migrants in California, for instance, that are super conservative, and what's going to move the needle on them in terms of their thinking about fertility. I think, I think in terms of the causal link, I think what we're thinking about is like a whole bunch of Filipinos that are pretty conservative, that are all abroad in different places, and they're getting these slightly different shocks, right? And so, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to go out like advocating for everybody to adopt the pill or something. That's not what I'm trying to say at all, but that they're getting like this differential exposure that's maybe changing things in some small way. And so I think, I guess in terms of like, I can show you like the parallel trends, I can show you all that kind of stuff, but I think that's not so much what you're thinking about. You're thinking about like, why would this mechanism actually work, right? Like, why would this actually happen? And I think, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm trying to think. I guess I could. Like, I think, no, I mean, I guess what I was just going to say is like, the answer I would give to a non-Filipino audience is not what I want to give to you. I'm actually really curious what you think of, like, is there a link here that you think could matter? So I'm curious what you think too.
No, sorry, I just want to end because if the analysis, for instance, would be limited to only migrant households, right, in the census, then the effect could be actually, something direct, that migrant exposure affects the behavior of migrant households only. Right, but when you start including non-migrant households in the census, in the analysis, right, then we start to think about, okay, what's actually driving effects.
I see. Yep. So we actually did do that. I didn't show it here, but this is something that we separated out the birth rates for households that had an OFW sometime in the last 5 years versus households that didn't. That's kind of the best we can do with the census. And so we found that, much of the effects are coming through the migrant households, which I think is the channel that you would think is plausible. But we did find smaller, significant effects on the non-migrant households, which I think is super interesting in the sense that it's suggesting that there's some sort of diffusion to these non-migrant households, but most of it is coming through the people that are exposed themselves. So so we should probably lead with that as a story to make it a little more convincing about the mechanism. Is that what you would say? Okay, that's super, super helpful. Thank you so much. It's really great.
Yeah.
And I should say, if anyone has questions after or comments, please just email me. I would love to hear any thoughts that you have. So
we have 2 more questions in the chat. May I call Jeremiah? Jeremiah, are you on Zoom? Actually, Jeremiah, if I'm not mistaken, works with Alvin on migration. You might have met.
Yes, I've met Jeremiah for sure.
Jeremiah, can you ask your question yourself? Jeremiah, are you there? Okay, but his question is on the chat box. I will read it. This interesting paper empirically carried on a concept called social remittances. coined by sociologist Peggy Levitt. Even if focusing precisely on fertility behavior, is there a sense from the results that international migration is the indirect yet expensive contraceptive measure for the Philippines to lower its birth rates? That's the first question. Do these results also provide some good news to the Philippines, which some say is entering or has entered the demographic window period that leads to a demographic dividend? Caroline.
Great, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much, Jeremiah. This is great. We should definitely frame this as about social remittances. You're absolutely right. I think that's not really the way we framed it in the paper. We were kind of thinking of it as norms, but I think for people who think about migration, calling it social remittances is a good way to go. So we can definitely do that. In terms of, is this an indirect yet expensive contraceptive method to lower its birth rates? Yeah, I mean, I think what we should probably do is a more rigorous, like back of the envelope calculation that looks at this on a national scale. One thing that we've been working on that we don't have quite done yet, so I didn't show them to you, are asymmetric effects, because I think, you know, I'm thinking about this, the way I'm framing all of this to you is something becomes more liberalized and the birth rate declines, but of course it can go the other way too, right? You're exposed to more conservative policies. So now, you know, all the Filipinos that are in the US are being exposed to us adopting much more conservative policies about reproductive health. That could cause people to double down on some of their, you know, say less liberalized views about fertility. So we should really do some sort of back of the envelope calculation to try to say what this means for the Philippines as a whole based on the composition of exposure that migrants are receiving. And then finally, do these results provide some good news to the Philippines? I think I want to be careful here in that, like, acknowledging that, you know, I'm an American that has been so gratefully welcomed into the Philippines to do work there. And I want to be careful that I'm just kind of documenting this as a result. And I don't want to necessarily put any prior on that. But I hope that you all will make of these results what you will. And I'd love to talk about them more in terms of what I think about them. But I do want to, like, acknowledge my place as an outsider and not necessarily come down on that too harshly. But I'm happy to talk about it with you, Jeremiah, offline. So I've known Jeremiah for a long time. So great.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. We have another question from Manolo Abelia. Manolo, can you ask your question yourself? We'd love to hear your voice.
Thank you. To start with, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Theoharides for this work, because I know it's an extremely difficult subject to address given the paucity of data in this field. First question that I have in mind is, based on my experience from looking at the data from PUA, is that the addresses are quite deceptive as where people are coming from. So when you try to relate this to the provinces where you have data on adoption of contraceptive methods, I wonder whether one can easily link the data of the coming from the PUA with the data from the surveys of fertility in different provinces. But I'm not saying that this is an important issue. Maybe you have dealt with this, so I don't know. I just want to be clarified. My second question is how you control for self-selection. And I know that I'm sure that you have addressed this issue from the very beginning. And perhaps my difficulty is that was not able to read your paper ahead of time, so I didn't really get a chance to reflect on what you've done. But it seems to me that it's very likely that prospective migrants, because they want to be able to go abroad without worrying too much about children or family, bigger family, that they're probably the most open to any ideas about fertility control. So, so are they, do you have a self-selection problem? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. These are such great questions. I think on your first question, this is this is exactly right. I think some of the OFWs, they've come to Manila to work with a recruiting agency. They're staying in a rooming house or something. And so they just put that address in Manila. So I think one thing that we do to try to address this, and one thing that I've done in all of my work with the POEA data, is try to show the robustness of the results to dropping Manila. That will mean, of course, that, if somebody came from Cavite to Manila and they list Manila, that I have an undercount in Cavite, but I think that biases me against finding the results because I would be saying there are fewer migrants that are actually there. One thing that we did try to do is I also worked with OA and matched the data set with the POEA data with the OA data. And I think the OA data, because they want to have the correct address for, and please correct me if you think this is not true, but I think because they want to have the correct address for their family members in case there's some sort of typhoon or natural disaster, I think they're a little bit better about providing where their family actually is as opposed to maybe to POEA. But even that aside, I think it's still a big concern. And so that's one of the reasons that we do drop Manila and to try to show the robustness of that, to try to address that. But we should be more explicit about that in the paper as well, to get at that concern directly. And then in terms of the self-selection, this is a great question. And I think this is exactly why I think the studies that compare migrants to non-migrants, some of the earlier work that's been done, are really problematic, because I think it's pretty likely that people who are choosing to migrate abroad might be more open to birth control, maybe because they don't want to get pregnant while they're abroad, or maybe because they're more willing to try new things. They're more willing to go abroad. They're more willing to try a new contraceptive method. Who knows, right? There could be a lot of different things here. So that's why we want to compare only people who are migrants, and we want the difference to be where they went to in terms of destination. Now, it could be people who are more open choose to go to Italy rather than choose to go to Saudi. And so then that would be a problem based on what these previous studies have done. And so that's why we use the shocks to the policies, because what it essentially means is that we're comparing two people who went to Saudi Arabia, but one had the positive shock and one didn't. And so we're able to kind of separate out that self-selection by thinking about, you and I both chose to go to Saudi Arabia, but I experienced this change in policy and you didn't. Let's see how that changed the differences in our outcomes to try to get at it that way. So I think this is a really important question, because I think that's really what we're trying to have be our contribution of this paper beyond what has been done before.
All
Thank
right.
you very much.
Thank you so much.
May we know your institutional affiliation? Where are you from?
I've retired a long time ago.
Okay. I see. Okay.
I've read a lot of your work, though. It's been so helpful for me. So thank you so much for joining. I cite your work all the time.
All right. Oh, that's good to know. All right. So it's already 4 minutes past 11. This is a very good discussion, but we don't want to keep Caroline since it's already 10 o'clock, I believe, where you are. Is that right? 10 p.m. Yeah. So we've come to the end of this seminar. But before we end or close, I'd like to invite you, to the next seminar. And also later on, I would be inviting you to turn on your camera so that we can have a photo opportunity with our speaker this morning. Can you see my screen? Okay, can you see my screen? Okay, yeah. So our next seminar would be on March 29. So it will be 4 p.m. and it's on redistributive policy shocks and optimal monetary policy with heterogeneous agents. So our speaker would be Dr. Chetan Gate from New Delhi. So that will be on March 29. And as I've said earlier, our materials from the seminar is available in our website, and recordings of previous seminar, including this, will hopefully be posted in the campus YouTube. So you just go, you just go try to find our Ateneo de Manila YouTube channel. And for those of you who will be requesting a certificate for today's seminar, for a certificate of participation, I believe Tweetums will be sending the link, and the request will be available, will be open for a limited time only. So now we've come to the let me request everyone to turn on their camera so we can have a photo opportunity with Caroline. 3 times. Are we ready?
Moment. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Another. 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Okay, so again, please join me in thanking our speaker today, Dr. Caroline Theoharides. Very good discussion. Thank you, thank you. Okay, so that concludes our seminar this morning. So I hope you all have a good day and have a good night, Caroline, and to those joining us from the other parts of the world. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. This was so helpful. Your comments were wonderful. And I put my email. If you have any other thoughts, please email me. I'd be happy to jump on Zoom anytime. So
we hope to see you and welcome you again in campus, Caroline.
I hope very soon. Yes. Thank you all so much.
Okay. Bye, everyone.